Welcome, dear students, to the massive open online course on Political Economy 1. In today's module, we are going to talk about development and state capitalism. The basic objectives of our module today are as follows. In this module, we intend to explore the history of state capitalism as a construct. We would like to understand the evolution of state capitalism through the ages, and finally we try to understand the role of state capitalism in the process of development. Now let us go back to Polanyi's classic writing of 1944, where he suggested that markets have always been state-mediated. The realm of the market is constrained when state intervention takes place, and this occurs once the market shakes off its societal obligations. Many other scholars have differentiated state capitalism from capitalism more broadly in that the former, that is state capitalism, characterizes circumstances in which the economic prerogatives of the state exceed those that are merely expected from capitalism's intrinsic properties, as told by Sperber. In that sense, the contrast between capitalism and state capitalism was basically the prevalence of social or common ownership of assets as opposed to private property, and the reliance on state directives and imposed prices rather than on markets to make decisions about what to produce and how to sell it. If we look at the history of state capitalism as a construct, we find that there are two constitutive instantiations of state capitalism here. Number one, states' ownership and operation of capitalist enterprises, which is basically the state capital, and the state's control or influence over the activities of private economic actors, occasionally denoted as statism. So when I get two concepts, that is, one is state capital versus statism, we find that the first dimension, that is state capital, defines state capitalism as the widespread influence of the government in the economy. So how can the government assess their influence over the economy? They can either own a majority or minority equity position in the companies, or they can provide subsidized credit or other privileges to the private companies. In this way, the government can assess or provide influence. The second dimension, which we have called it as statism, emphasizes basically a capitalist economic system where the role of the state is dominant in terms of investment, in terms of production, in terms of distribution in the economy, through its own undertaking in commercial activities or control over corporations. If we look at the evolution of state capitalism, we find that the term state capitalism was initially coined by Wilhelm in 1896. And it was done basically to differentiate the socialist state and the state takeover of private companies, such as, say, railways. So we have on the one hand the concept of a socialist state. On the other hand, we have private companies and the government or the state coming up and taking over those companies. So here, he basically tried to differentiate the state ownership of the means of production from the concept of state capitalism. In the immediate post-war period, there was a rapid increase in state ownership of enterprises around the world as private firms were either failing, or we find that private firms were increasingly nationalized to prevent any sort of future or larger layoffs. This phenomenon we cannot say that it was really done intentionally by the government or the state. This was characterized more by some sort of accidental ownership than by any explicit strategy of nationalization and statization. Then we came to the period of the Great Depression. The rise of the large governments, which was an after effect or a consequence of the Great Depression. And we also saw a consolidation of the totalitarian states in the interwar years. This led to a different conceptualization of state capitalism altogether. So now we find that state capitalism is not only about ownership, but now after the Great Depression, state capitalism was more of state intervention in the economy in general. That is more of statism. Then we have the Nazi control with state control of investment and production. So Nazis became the ultimate example of this model. Italy centralized control over a variety of nationalized companies under a state-owned holding company. The government of France nationalized the railways, airlines, and a variety of other industries. So throughout the world, at this period of time after the Great Depression, just because we found that many of the companies were failing, and to prevent any sort of layoffs, large layoffs that is obvious to create unemployment, the government came to rescue them. So we can call this type of this as not a very much accidental in character, this type of state takeovers of these private companies. Now, the importance of state in the economy increased after World War II. The economic and the industrial mobilization that occurred after World War II dramatically increased the power and the prestige of the national governments, because now national governments came to be looked as economic managers, because they were very deftly and efficiently had been managing the economic systems. Moreover, governments all over the world, they continued to nationalize industries including coal, steel, airways, electricity, gas, and whatnot. And state ownership of productive companies probably, peaked between the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So throughout the world, you see that many companies were being taken over by the states. And of course, those companies were not only loss-making companies, they were also productive companies. Now comes the era of the 70s and the 80s. In the 70s and the 80s, the economic travels in the communist bloc raised questions about the efficiency of state ownership. We had two recessions during this period. One that was triggered by the oil shock and the stagflation that was witnessed in the 70s and the 1980s resulted in fiscal crisis in many of the westernized world's state-owned enterprises. During this period, the conceptualization of state capitalism was linked to inefficiency and a threat to business. The wave of privatization was largely motivated by this characterization and the government's need for resources to reduce their debt burden and their current expenses. Next, we come to the role of state capitalism in the process of development. We have observed a tendency towards state capitalism where states are increasingly active within markets. They're increasingly active as entrepreneurs and also as owners of capital, as well as regulatory agents in the world economy. Across the income spectrum, states have embraced the role of agents of transformation and development. In the global south, one way these trends manifest is in the proliferation of new modalities of specialized industrial policy underpinned by large-scale development projects. So, in very simple language, if I need to explain whatever I said just now, we need to understand one thing, that if we look at all types of state, be they developed economies or the less developed economies, we find that state have increasingly taken the role of agents of transformation and development. So mostly if we look, the global south here essentially refers to as the less developed economies. We see that these trends are manifesting themselves in some sort of modalities that represent specialized industrial policy, and also we find that in these economies, large-scale developmental projects are being undertaken. If you want to look at these examples of these type, they include the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, we have Indonesia Vision 2045, we have Morocco's New Development Model, we have in Mexico the development aspects of Mexico's fourth transformation. So in most of the global south, that is the third world economies, we find how state plays an active role in the development process. Now some of these plans have benefited from the rise of China and its multi-billion dollar this BRI or the Belt and Road Initiative, which traditional development actors now increasingly seek to counter by providing alternative initiatives to China. Because some people do see this BRI as a very important threat to the sovereignty of their economies. So they are increasingly trying to seek some sort of alternative initiatives. So now, slowly, this concept of state capitalism have seen an evolutionary phenomena, and now we are coming to a sort of multi-dimensional logic where we define state capitalism as an economic system in which the state uses various tools for proactive intervention in economic production and the functioning of markets. So state not only plays a development role, but also when we look at the markets in general, state is also playing a proactive interventionist role in the economic production and also in the functioning of the markets. And when I talk about markets, we find that state intervention is occurring within the home market and also abroad in the interest of both the domestic firms and also for diplomatic purposes. The states may intervene by owning a significant percentage of productive assets through various forms of statism. Now, what are the various forms of statism that we are talking about here? Suppose government subsidies, investments, consumption, various regulatory instruments, formal and informal coordinating mechanisms. So state can use any of these type of instruments to play its role. And these interventions guide the economic activity in ways that may or may not challenge the private businesses. They encompass protection for oligopolistic firms and unconventional monetary policy interventions. Overall, we view state capitalism through the lens of variation, complexity, and multidimensionality, and not simply whether a country follows state capitalism or not. So, it is important to stress that state capitalism is not a static category or a state of being. Its specific features are dynamic dimensions of the process of development out of the era of colonial domination and into that of modern industrial capitalism. And within this process, there are tensions and contradictions. These tensions and contradictions both retard and propel any sort of further evolution in the system. Now, if I try to look at the goal of the state planners, we find that the central goal of the state planners is rapid economic growth. How do we achieve rapid economic growth? The only way to achieve rapid economic growth is heavy industrialization and using the most modern technology, which is usually financed by the expansion of the export sector. So you will get very good examples of these where you find that outward-looking strategies have been practiced by economies like Korea, mainly the new emerging economies or the Southeast Asian nations. There exists a private domestic capitalist sector in commerce and in industry and agriculture, but initially it is weak and small. Private foreign capital is an important participant in the industrialization process in several ways. Number one, through international banks like public and private financing development projects under the state's central plan. Through joint ventures in the export sector, like the state may own, say, 51% of all the mining and the hydrocarbon companies, but the international firms may bid for the other 49%. Number three, through contracts to build factories and infrastructure and to train workers on which it is allowed a fair return. So after understanding what are the various ways in which state capitalism can contribute to the development of an economy, we tend to understand the superiority of the capitalist markets. Now, we have the state capitalist markets and the capitalist markets, and allocation of investment funds to industries and sectors, the construction of economically necessary infrastructure, intersectoral and inter-industrial relations are supervised usually by a central plan. But capitalist markets are equally important because, number one, enterprises are allocated new investment funds by the state banks on the basis of previous profitability, and their success is evaluated by the central planners in terms of their market-determined rate of return. So here we find that banks, which are also under the control of the state, they are allowed to allocate new investment funds to various enterprises based on the fact that what was the previous profitability of those enterprises, what was their success rate, and how they have been evaluated by the central planners in terms of their market-determined rate of return. We also find that a substantial proportion of agricultural and industrial goods is distributed through unregulated markets, although the state retains the authority to intervene to fix prices and quotas. So we see that in most of the economies, the marketing of agriculture and industrial goods, this distribution does not always take place in markets that are regulated by the state. They do take place in unregulated markets also, but here, how does the state play its role? The state plays its role by intervening to fix price, quotas, and things like that. So here we also see how the interventionist role of the state can play a huge role in the development process. Number three, a substantial proportion of output is also exported. Thus, the domestic price and market structure are integrated with the world capitalist market. The market in wage labor expands along with industrial expansion. Because as with industrial expansion, we will need laborers, and so the market in wage labor will also expand. The wage labor force will grow as poor peasants and other small-scale producers can no longer make their living in the pre-capitalist sector. The rate of employment also is here very high, possibly around 50%. The military officers and the bureaucrats who control the state, they represent a diffuse nationalist middle class, the service-oriented petty bourgeois in the cities, and the better-off rural peasants. The society is administered from the top by a technocracy of educated experts, and the working class is not represented in the ruling group, and the workers are not allowed to form organizations outside the framework of the national organization. The national organization is a single party which is headed by top officers and bureaucrats, and manifestations of class struggles are gradually suppressed. Here we encounter barriers also. The barriers can be elucidated as follows. Number one, the growth of industry in the state capitalist country requires not only the provision of expandable wage labor force, but also the cheapening of manufactured commodities which these workers consume so that the wage bill can be kept down. But again, if we try to look at it from the other angle, the cheapening of these goods in turn will require either that they're imported from a place where they are made more cheaply, which puts a strain in the balance of payment, and this often will lead to inflation and crisis in the economy. Or also, they may be produced at home by more efficient methods. And another thing that has to be kept in mind that this cannot be done within the confines of the low productivity pre-capitalist sectors left as part of the heritage of colonialism in most of the countries. We can think of raising productivity in the domestic wage goods manufacture, so that would require the destruction of the pre-capitalist forms and the further extension of industrialization in the state capitalist country. We encountered another obstacle, that a backward agricultural sector. Slow growth of productivity in the peasant food production keeps the value of wage workers' subsistence basket of commodities high relative to the value of what they produce, thus keeping the rate of profit down. The higher rate of industrial growth in an agriculturally backward country actually entails a lower standard of living for workers and the peasants, since unless there were increased productivity, we will not get a higher profit rate. That is an increase in capitalists' share of total product, and this would require a lower wage rate. So I don't think we need any explanation in this front, because whenever we want a higher profit rate, that can be possible only when the cost of production is low. And the cost of production, wage being a very important part of the cost of production, we need to have a lower wage rate. Next, the social relations of production in the pre-capitalist agriculture. This is also a very important barrier to modern development, for if the peasants can have access to land through traditional tenure, even if their standard of living is oppressively low, they will not become differentiated into capitalist farmers and hired workers. A third barrier to the process of state capitalist development is that the growth of large-scale modern industry and agriculture requires the numerical expansion, physical concentration, and education of the modern working class. So, whatever has done and has been said, whenever we try to promote industrial and agricultural growth, along with expansion and physical concentration, the education of the working class is a very, very important segment of human capital formation. This class, this working class, educated working class, can pose a formidable threat to the rule of the capitalist class and the state, contrary to the nationalist classless ideology of the latter, when its members become aware of the focal role in the production process and conceive the possibility of socialism under different leadership. In Turkey, for example, in the late 40s and 50s, a private capitalist class finally emerged from the cocoon spun by the state capitalism of the previous 25 years. So within 10 years, the working class there began to assert their political independence, insisting on their own organization and ideology, and rising to overt struggle with the Turkish capitalist class, though they have not yet attained a revolutionary status. So we can conclude this by saying that many of the characteristics of state capitalism were evident in some of the now advanced countries like Russia, Germany, Japan in the late 19th century, and can also be seen in certain third world economies at a certain stage in their histories. I just mentioned about Turkey. We witnessed it in the 1920s and 30s, in Egypt under Nasir. In India, in the 50s and 60s, we had state capitalism. Algeria since 1965, and Peru since 1968. This phenomenon is an increasingly important part in the expansion of world capitalism in the post-war period. While each of these countries has its own unique history and dynamic, there are two general lessons to be gleaned from this historical pattern. First, Not one of the state capitalist countries has yet had a peaceful transition to socialism. The end result in all cases so far has been capitalism. So state capitalism has never given way to socialism, which has been thought of. Rather, always the result has been from state capitalism to capitalism, as Turkey witnessed in the example that I gave you. Second, the severe and often ugly developmental problems faced by the former colonial countries industrializing in the 20th century are not due to their dependence on the advanced capitalist economies. They are due to the essential realities of capitalistic development, which is now and has always been uneven, unequal, and oppressive for the producing classes. The histories of England, the alleged cases of classic autochthonous capitalist development, and that of United States with the best internally articulated market in history, are also laced with misery and dispossession of the majority of the producers. In the state capitalist countries, as in advanced capitalist countries, the path out of these history is through the struggle of the workers. Given this worldwide scope and rapid growth of industrial capitalism today, workers in both types of countries should be able to learn more quickly from their common experience and bring their common struggle to maturity that much sooner, so that they learn from whatever has happened to their counterparts. Thank you.